Welcome to the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast from Never Too Late Cafe. I'm your host, Laura Womack. Each week we sit down for a chat with someone just like you, someone who had an idea, a passion, a dream, or sometimes just a thought, and planted that seed, watched it grow into something they wanted to share with the world. If you have an idea for a topic or someone that would be a guest for the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast, feel free to reach out to us on Facebook, where you can join our Never Too Late Cafe Facebook group. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome, everyone, for part 2 of our conversation with Julie Lamb. We've talked about your writing, so let's just dive right into talking about your publication.
My first book of poetry is getting ready to come out, and I'm very excited. And
Awesome.
I feel so thankful. And that's all, in and of itself, the way that came about is also a collection of ripples of people that, because this situation aligned with this situation, you know, this ripple turned into a wave, and this wave turned into a sea, and a sea turns into a dream. And so it's incredible because during the pandemic, I had come back, and I came across someone who is a mentor to so many, Dick Wilson. And Dick Wilson, he's also just someone who inspires so many and connects so many dream weavers. And I remember there was a day that he's like, I think that there is a kindred spirit that you must meet. There's someone that and he sets up this conversation between Lee Pennington and Dick Wilson, and then there's me on this call. And this is in the pandemic days, where this is when everything was shut down. And so what's I think really wild to me is that in a time that I felt so unsure of what life was going to look like, because I had just come back, and so I'm sort of ready to sort of soar into this new chapter right when the world starts to stall. And because of that, I was able to take this time to really dive into building what would become this book. And I remember having this conversation with Lee, and it's just like Dick Wilson said, it was just like immediately we connected. And he was so gracious and said to send him a poem. And I remember already having written some poems, because when I was abroad, I was off in coffee shops, just writing in notebooks, and not knowing that was going to become so much of what would turn into this book. It was my way at the time of just processing the world around me. And sometimes I would share just, you know, what I had jotted down with a friend. And because sometimes I think that when I write something, I will see it differently after I've written it than when I'm living through it. And so I remember trying to choose what's going to be the first poem that I send to Lee Pennington. Because if you even know anything about Lee Pennington, if someone knows his name, you know that he is a genius poet. I mean, he lives poetry. And he is also, like Dick Wilson, someone who's just so kind, and he inspires so many to go out there and also live poetry too. And I remember sending him my first poem, and trying to choose it felt like trying to choose it's like trying to choose a child almost, of, well, I don't know which one is going to be the one that I lead with, because each poem represents a different side of you. And also there's such a vulnerable experience of sharing just a piece of your soul with someone. And so I remember sharing this poem with him, and he just had the most beautiful response. And I remember he was just talking about it, that it's the kind of poem that makes you want to scream yes into the universe. And he wanted to talk on the phone immediately after. And so we had a phone conversation again. And I still remember he told me to remember that day. And he said to mark that day, because that's the day that I need to realize I'm one day going to write a book. And it's not just going to be a dream that it's going to happen. And so because of this connection, Lee and I started to exchange poems. And so I would send him a poem and we would have a volley of thoughts. And the more that I would share with him, the more I felt comfortable sharing more. And the more that I felt that comfort, the more I decided that there was space to push. And I really feel that that was so important. It's so important to have someone who believes in you. I remember even before I went off to Tel Aviv, you know, I was there was a mentoring program at the University of Louisville. It was like an honors program. And I remember being connected with Jen Woods. And that's someone who was also so impactful, because I had always thought poetry was amazing. But before I connected with her, I thought that that was something that was for other people that were, you know, talented poets, and I would admire it from afar. And it's because of that connection that I felt like there was space for me to try, that you don't have to conform to one specific way of creating art. And each of these connections matters. And so with Lee, I feel like that just, I mean, it really did change my life. He gave me the space to feel confident to push. And so I would go back and revisit stories that I might have started, and I would push for more, because so many times it's so easy when you're writing to hold back, because sometimes you're holding back because you're worried what maybe other people might think. But also sometimes you're holding back because just even writing poetry, not even sharing it, but writing it is such a vulnerable experience, because sometimes we will hold back from ourselves, whether in art or just in our thoughts and perspectives. And so I really feel like yes, I felt like this book was such a journey of catharsis for me, because there were so many things that I might have held back from digging deeper. And with Lee's guidance and his vote of confidence, I felt like there was room to try. Because I think one of the most important things that I learned from him is he always will say that there's beauty in everything. Like there can be beauty in something that someone else might find ugly or messy. You know, there's beauty in the unspoken, the things that we shove down. And so I think that when someone has confidence in you, it gives you new freedom to feel like you can have a say on some of these things that you might otherwise shove down. And that became this first book that's coming out. And also because of Lee, I was able to connect with Tony Acree, and he's starting this new poetry division of Hydra Publications called Pennington Press, which is named after
I
Lee.
didn't know that. Oh my gosh,
yes.
I didn't know that.
So that also feels like such a Universes Precise moment again, because he has just been, I mean, he's been such a mentor. Also, he's been such a friend. And so to have had that conversation where he said, remember today, one day you will have a book. And to now have my first book released under Pennington Press, it really is such a dream.
Oh, that's amazing. So that part of Hydra is doing your book, the Pennington Press.
Yes.
Oh,
yes,
that's awesome.
And I think it's a new I think it's going to be this new umbrella for poets, and so I feel honored to have my book soar with them, and also the fact that Tony is giving me space to be able to have my voice out in the world. I mean, all it takes throughout all these collection of stories and experiences, there is something instrumental about the person who gives you the opportunity to try, the person who sees that there is a window beyond potential, and the person who gives you those first breaks. I mean, again, all of these things ripple out into the world.
When I was growing up, I knew of him as Uncle Lee, and then when we reconnected, I think it was in 2017, and he was still, we tried to figure out who we were to each other, and we kind of figured out we were second cousins. He was my dad's cousin. So then recently, when I was down in Louisville, I said to him, I'm going to tell you, you've been Uncle Lee my whole life, and I would feel a whole lot better if I could just call you that, because it just feels more what I know you as. And he got really quiet, and I didn't know his reaction because he was so quiet. And he looked down and he goes, well, I've lost a cousin, but I've gained a niece. So I was like, great.
That sounds just like Lee.
He has an answer for everything. So anyway.
Yes, he does. And also he is tremendously open-minded as well. Like he's very much someone who goes with the flow. And if that flow shifts, he takes it, and he takes it in colorful stride.
Yeah. So, well, this podcast is called Bloom Where You're Planted. And I ask everyone that's a guest. Only one person didn't. And I'm going to have him back on because I was like, we did all this long talking and our storytelling, but we didn't get to the questions. So I've told him, you need to come back. Anyway.
Oh my gosh, yes, a sequel, a highly anticipated sequel.
Yeah. So what does Bloom Where You're Planted mean to Julie Lamb?
Well, before I answer that, I just also want to mention that is just such a beautiful name. It's such a beautiful question, but it's also such a beautiful name for your podcast. And I hope you know that's something that, I mean, each person will have a different answer to that. And so I think it's such a special way to anchor each of these conversations. And so I just want you to know, I find it such a thought-provoking question, and I'm really excited to answer it. I think it's so easy to think that you can bloom when the agriculture is just right. If the sun's out, if the terrain is just smooth and steady, if you have enough shade, it's so easy for us to get caught up in these expectations where we think that blooming happens when everything is flourishing in your life. And it's so easy to forget that there's so much value in those periods of transformation. It's so easy to forget that before a butterfly goes off bursting into transcendent color, it is covered in goo and it is shielded from the light. It's in it's sticky and it's messy, it's unseemly. And it's so easy to think that that's not where growth happens, that growth looks a certain way, that success looks a certain way, that triumph looks a certain way. And so I think that there really is something to be said about being able to honor each part of what growth looks like. Because sometimes when there is just a rainstorm of life and it is just drenching you, that rain might be exactly the thing that helps you bloom where you're planted and you don't know it. And it's so easy to look over, and we're in an age where we will see everyone else's highlights, and it's so easy to think that every single person has it together. But really, you could be the person that has it together from a distance. You know, we're all really blooming where we're planted. You don't have to be a certain person to be able to bloom. You don't have to live a certain place to be able to experience growth and joy and everything that you want. And if there's anything that I have learned from just rising and falling and flying all over again many a time, I feel like a cat that has had 9 lives. I think that we all have that capacity to bloom. And I think that there is so much value in those moments we don't see it. And I think that it's so easy to lose patience when we're in a moment of of healing, because healing does not look linear. It will look like 5 steps backward before you're able to be on that Olympic trajectory forward. And I think that there's something special actually about those moments that we are building resilience and we don't even know it. Because it's so easy to celebrate the petals. It's so easy to celebrate spring, because spring, suddenly everything's bursting into life. But every season matters. Autumn teaches us about this. There is just electric gold in the power of letting go. And winter teaches us that it's okay to be still. And sometimes loss has to happen for spring to be able to burst forward. And it's so easy to see, with summer, the sun is out, the days are longer, we feel alive, we feel free. But each moment of our lives is us building and burgeoning forward.
What a wonderful explanation. You have had some wonderful mentors, and they give you words. And I also ask, what sort of words of wisdom would you share with someone that wants to do what you've done or are doing? And that could be you're traveling, you're writing, you're sharing on Instagram, which has a lot of your poetic expression on it. So what sort of words of wisdom would you share with anyone that hears this podcast?
I can think of 2 stories of my life that I have held on to that I think that it would be so, that's what I would share. Is I remember in college, I was in this class and I thought that I was out of my league. I remember there was a girl in that class, and every time that she answered, she just had the most brilliant answer. She would reference history in this class, and it was an English class, I remember, some kind of literature class, but she would reference historical context, and she would be able to offer these insights. And I just remember being in this class and feeling like she just seemed like she was soaring. And I remember we both stayed after class one day to ask the professor a question, and someone else is in line before us. And so we get to talking. And so all of a sudden this girl starts talking to me, and she was like, oh my gosh, I feel so lost. And I remember being shocked. I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, I feel like half the time I'm talking about history because I don't even know some of these things that we're talking about in this literature lens. And she said, and you seem like you know A, B, and C. And so I remember just walking away from this interaction so bemused, because in my mind, this is someone that she seemed like she was on top of the world, and she was remarkably human, just like all of us were. And so I think that's the first thing that I would share is there's no reason that whoever is listening to this and whoever wants to go after something, there's no reason that it can't be you. Someone else is looking across and thinking that you're already on your way, and thinking that what the things that they would do if they were in your place. And it's also okay to be vulnerable about looking across and seeing someone else, because I think that that's just human nature. The very first way that we learn to make sense of the world is to compare. But I think that it's important to note it could be you. There's no reason that you can't be the person that's figuring it out, because all of us are. None of us have it all together. None of us are fully cooked. We're all growing constantly. And I think the second story I would share is there was a company I ended up joining when I was in Israel. And I remember they were doing fascinating things. They were exploring about the impact of technology and its transformation on the world. And I remember having already submitted a resume to this company just because I was so intrigued with what they were doing. And I went to this job fair with said partner in crime from that I mentioned before, my friend Claudia. We went to this job fair together. And I remember we still laugh because we went to this cafe where they talked about having alternative coffees, and there were none of the coffees that they advertised were there that day. So it was definitely a day of so much adventure. And I remember going to this job fair and talking to a person who was at that booth, who represented this company. And I was talking to her about my interest in potentially exploring that opportunity further. And I remember her telling me that I didn't have the experience that they were looking for, that not to even bother applying or sending anything because they were looking for someone who fit a certain box. And I had no shot. And it's amazing because I happen to have already applied to this company, but I remember walking away feeling so discouraged because I was really curious to hear more. And so the reason I'm mentioning this story is I actually ended up landing this role. And I remember throughout this interview process, the whole time, I remember talking to my mom, because, mothers always have infinite wisdom in those moments that you're questioning your life and your place in the world. And I remember her telling me, you just happened to talk to the wrong person that day. That doesn't mean that you don't belong with this company, and that doesn't mean that you aren't capable of achieving that role. And so I remember talking to who would become my boss at that company. And I mean, he was such a kind and just brilliant leader. And I remember being in the final round of interview stages. I remember talking to him, and it never ceased to amaze me because I ended up fulfilling this role, and I was up against people that had more experience than I did and fit that exact box that woman at that booth had told me I did not fill. And so that's the second thing that I think I would tell anyone who's looking to do something that they care about, is not to let yourself be psyched out by what you think you don't have or the things you think you haven't been able to do yet. Because truly, especially when it comes to stories, meeting people, that's a story. And maybe someone just doesn't understand your story yet, but you can show them. And also, as long as you know yourself, what you're capable of, if you paint a world that doesn't exist yet, you have the power to do that.
Mm. So what's next for Julie Lamb?
Well, I'm really just, I feel my heart beating in my chest because very soon my first book is coming out. And it really is a lifelong dream. I remember just going to the bookstores with my father. And again, I mean, books were sacred in our house. Words were magical in my house. And I remember we would go together. And so I think that will be a dream when I one day see my book out. And my book will be in someone's hands. And maybe someone else will be reading my story and relating in a totally different way. And then beyond that, I just look forward to being able to tell more stories, because I'm forever captivated by, again, the magic of storytelling. And just there's so much magic in people and in the world, even in a world in chaos, turmoil, and even when we are so full of uncertainty. I'm excited because I think that what's next is there's still so much capacity for connection. And I think that there's healing in that. And I think that there is something really beautiful about each of us telling our own truth, knowing that truth is subjective. There's no one truth, and our truth changes from day to day. My truth yesterday might be different than my truth tomorrow. But I look forward to telling more stories. I look forward to writing more, and seeing what that does, and seeing how it lands in the world, seeing how my voice echoes in the universe.
So what is the name of your book?
It's called The Ones That Made Their Mark.
Oh, okay. That's a very
and it's
good
a collection
title.
of poems. Thank you. I'm really, really excited about it. I'm terrified as well. I mean, it is the most vulnerable collection of stories I've ever written. So I feel like I am sharing my diary entries with the world.
Wow.
But so I think that can feel really scary. Some days I feel my stomach in my throat, but also I think that's why I'm so proud of it. I really think it's the best writing of my career. And I think it's because I was just so achingly honest. And I say that, like I said, honest in a sense of truth. It's ever changing and ever shifting. And, it was my truth the day that I might have written that poem, knowing that the world is full of different perspectives, knowing that my perspective is constantly evolving. But I think that that's what I will stand behind, is the fact that it really feels like these are pieces of me. And that's why I think it's so important to share it, because I know that I've had days where I will search and scour to find someone who feels the way that I do. Because I think that there's such a gift in being seen and understood and known. And so that's my hope, is maybe somewhere, someday, someone is off having a day of some sort. And maybe they will stumble upon my book, and maybe they will be living through their own experiences of the ones that made their mark in their life. And maybe that person might feel a little more seen, a little more understood. I think that would be, again, I think it would be magical.
Well,
the
Julie,
ability to connect with someone you haven't met.
It has been wonderful having you on, and I just wish you the best with your book. And
I just want to say it's been wonderful to be here. I mean, thank you so much for facilitating just such a beautiful conversation. I really feel like these conversations that you open opportunity to have, you open the opportunity to slow down and really think about life and, what someone's passionate about and the experiences that have shaped them, and being able to share that with others. I mean, again, I think that that's also a gift of storytelling. And I'm grateful that you had me on your podcast to participate in this. There's not a set release date, but I think it will be any day now. I think that the book is in its final stages. I think that the next you'll be hearing from me is that my dream is become a butterfly out in the world.
That is awesome. I look forward to reading it. And again, it's been great having you. And well, this is Laura Womack from Never Too Late Cafe with the Bloom Where You're Planted podcast. And my guest was Julie Lamb. And I'm just going to say bye for now. And thank you so much, Julie, for being here.
Thank you so much, Laura. I tremendously appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye now.